I've always been interested in the explorers, from Franklin in the Arctic down to Scott and Shackleton in the Antarctic. You could say I'm bipolar. Got all my Antarctic memorabilia here. Been collecting it all my life, really. That's my signed photo of Shackleton. I've got letters from Shackleton as well. He's sitting for a portrait. Oh. Here's a letter from Shackleton to Charles Bushell. Bushell was an artist. He's arranging for a sitting for a portrait. Shackleton said, I'll be there for a final sitting after Christmas. This is December 1919, and nobody knows what the portrait is. So I'm gonna look into that. That's an original photograph of Scott's discovery coming home from Antarctica. I've even got this little scrap of paper there. That's from Cherry, explaining that he's an Eastbourne. Look at that. Terrible lighting, Chris. My missus is a photographer, you see. For her birthday, I got her a letter from Herbert Ponting. Wow, these are well safe, aren't they? Herbert Ponting. The British Antarctic Expedition. There's another letter from Ponting there, 1914. He's probably given a talk at the Royal Philharmonic Hall. I mean, Herbert Ponting, he took some of the most iconic photos of the 20th century, didn't he? You gotta have stuff like this. Nearing South Georgia in the James Caird after their epic voyage from Elephant Island. I actually went to see the James Caird up in Dulwich College. You can actually touch the boat and you can see the repairs that McNish made and strengthen it with the mast and the Stankham wheels. And I'm more interested in Shackleton than Scott, because Shackleton was more of a man of the people. He would be down with the boys having a laugh, whereas Scott was more locked away in his cabin and slightly more regimental. So I always preferred Shackleton. However, on Captain Scott's expedition to Antarctica on the Terra Nova, I became particularly interested in Mr. Apsley Cherry Garrard. Chrissy and I have just made a 7-hour journey by car from Land's End to Wheathampstead to visit the grave of Apsley Cherry Garrard.
It's not as far as going for the penguin's legs.
Well, it's not, no. From here all the way to the South Pole. Magical, really, isn't it? For 3 penguin eggs. When you come to places like this, you've always got to touch the memorial. We touched Tom Crean's grave. That was a bit special. I often ask myself why I was so interested in Cherry. It's written that his nickname was Cheery because he was always full of enthusiasm and always happy, and I can just imagine this young bloke wanting to be someone. Scott was looking for volunteers to go on the Terra Nova expedition to the South Pole. Cherry Garrard was always enamoured by his father's achievements out in India and China, and he wanted to live up to expectations. So he signed up for Scott's expedition, but he was refused because he had no experience of Antarctica. Even after being turned down, he offered Captain Scott £1,000 for the expedition. A couple of weeks later, he got a message from Captain Scott saying that he was overwhelmed with the gesture, and he got offered a spot on the Terra Nova. His first job was to lay supplies for the assault on the South Pole. They had 2 sledges and they were man-hauling these sledges across. They had to go 60 miles, but they had to do it in a relay because the weather and terrain was so bad. So they would march 1 mile, deposit it, go back, pick up the other sledge and then drag that. So they're walking 3 miles for every one gain. During the expedition, Cherry Garrard left the camp with Bowers and Wilson. They headed off on an expedition to Cape Crozier to collect penguin eggs. They thought that the embryos would tell the secrets of evolution. Total disaster. They managed to get, I think, 5 eggs, and Cherry Garrard dropped both of his, and they were suffering the cold of up to minus 37 degrees. On the way back, they lost their tent. So they're sleeping there underneath it in the snow, in the snow, sleeping in the snow, in a snow flurry, covered in snow. And they had to make a little shelter out of stones. And Cherry Garrard, he was so cold, he lost a lot of his teeth. They were chattering away, and he suffered with that for the rest of his life. So when the tent blew away, Cherry and Bowers and Wilson had to build themselves a little igloo out of stones. They would have killed with something like this. All they had was a few rocks about 2 foot high at the most. I don't know how they survived it. On the journey to Cape Crozier, Cherry Garrard suffered with myopia, which means that he couldn't see anything, and it was almost total darkness anyway. And he couldn't use his spectacles while he was sledging. When going out of there into the wind must have been hellish. Oh, hell's bells. On the journey back, they travelled maybe 1.5 miles a day, and that had been the winter journey, which Cherry turned into his book, The Worst Journey in the World. The title was actually given to him by his next door neighbour, George Bernard Shaw. There's a fantastic photo of the 3 of them on their return after the trip to Cape Crozier, and the state of them, it looks like they're from another planet, you know. It really does. So on the 1st of November, Cherry Garrard was in a team of men that were going to make the assault on the South Pole with Captain Scott. Cherry was in the 2nd supporting team that was sent back to base camp. Cherry Garrard was asked to look after the ponies and the dogs. Atkinson was meant to look after the dogs, but he was called away on a medical emergency. So there was only Cherry left. He was put in charge of looking after the dogs. Now this bloke's 24-year-old in the South Pole, and he's been told to look after the dogs. He was kind of responsible for the safety of his mates and his boss. So Captain Scott set off for the South Pole with 4 men: Evans, Wilson, Bowers and Oates. They were hauling sledges, and they could only manage about 2 miles a day, which just wasn't enough. They were never going to get to the South Pole first. Amazon got to the South Pole weeks before Scott did. So Scott and the team discovered the flag there. I mean, the photos of Captain Scott at the South Pole with the men, I mean, the heartbreak and anguish on their faces, it's haunted me for 40, 50 years, you know. So, on the given time, Cherry Garrard sets out with a dog team. The idea was to help Scott on his return. Now, Captain Scott at this time was 60 miles away, which in the scheme of things isn't far. It's like 3 sledding days, isn't it? 60 miles. And so Cherry waited at One Ton Depot for a week, and they wanted to go further south to try and find Scott, but the weather was atrocious. They turned back to base camp. Now, people have blamed Cherry for turning back and not going further south, but apparently minus 37 is a bit chilly. And to be quite frank with you, sometimes I look out of my front door and it's too cold for me to put the bins out, you know. If Cherry had stayed any longer waiting for Captain Scott, the dogs would have run out of food and they would have had to shoot a couple of them and fed them to the other dogs. So when Cherry got back to base camp, everyone was like panicking because he'd basically come back empty-handed. Where's Scott and the team, you know? By this time Evans had already died, and Lawrence Oates had sacrificed himself in a blizzard. He was suffering with a bad leg, so he just left the tent and went outside. The famous "I'm going outside, I may be some time" quote. That's heroism, isn't it? What a hero. Eventually Scott and the team got to within 11 miles, 10 or 11 miles of safety, but the blizzards and the weather was just atrocious, and Captain Scott lost his life with Cherry Garrard's friends Wilson and Bowers in a tent. A little while later, Cherry went out with the search team, and he was amongst the team that found the bodies in the tent. See, this was his 2 mates that he'd been on the worst journey in the world with to collect the penguin eggs, and his boss. And Cherry was blamed for Scott's death for years afterwards, and he lost his mind a bit after that. It drove him a bit crazy. He was only following orders, Cherry, wasn't he? He suffered from depression for the rest of his life, and he even abstained from having kids because he didn't want to pass his mental illness down to his kids. He's just a young guy doing what he was told. So Cherry lost his estate due to ill health. He sold up and moved down to Piccadilly. He bought a modest flat in Piccadilly, and that's where I believe he died some years later, in the 50s. It's a real sad story. The book of the century, Apsley Cherry Garrard. And here he is. There's 3 emperor penguin eggs that survived. They're in the Natural History Museum in London. Quite difficult to see though, actually. Yeah, it's a really sad story, you know. It gets me every time.